Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. And today I am coming to you with some historical nonfiction recommendations. In many ways, this video is just going to be my nonfiction November wrap up. I was kind of waiting to film it until I had 4 books to talk about, but I feel like if I waited until I finished a 4th book, this video would not go up until the new year. And I fully wanted it to go on and go up this year. I did a video like this back in the summer that was shockingly popular to me. I didn't realize so many people were interested in historical nonfiction recommendations, but I read some great historical nonfiction during Nonfiction November, and I felt like it was time to do one of these videos once again. So I would just say this is kind of Italian historical nonfiction, but the 3rd book that I'm going to talk about actually is about England. But the 4th book that I was really hoping to finish is also a book on Italian history. So I just can't be controlled. I'm always going to want to read about Italy. I'm going to go in chronological order with this. I'm just going to go from the first book that I read up to the last. And so the first book that I read was Emperor of Rome by Mary Beard. And I feel like this is the book that people are going to be the most interested in because this was a fairly hyped new release. It came out at the very end of October, so it just was perfect timing for Nonfiction November this year. And a lot of people really love Mary Beard. Mary Beard is a massive name in the classics community and specifically in the realm of Roman history. And she has made a name kind of as a popular historian that is apparently very approachable to someone who is new to the world of ancient Rome. I have always kind of had issues with this because I really did not take to Mary Beard's most famous book, which is called SPQR. SPQR is a massively popular book, and to a certain extent I understand why. Mary Beard is definitely a skilled writer, but this book is one that a lot of people will recommend as a beginner's place. Like, this is definitely the place to start with ancient Roman history. And to me, that has always been a very bizarre suggestion, frankly, because SPQR is not written in a linear fashion at all. By design, the book jumps around and it really jumps between time periods. It will mention people again multiple times when you thought you've moved past talking about certain events. It, to me, is a relatively confusing read. And so I would in no way say that it is a beginner's book. I know why people want to recommend it because it covers a large span of time, and that's what most beginners want. And so maybe there's not really a great beginner's nonfiction out there for ancient Rome. But I went into Emperor of Rome with some trepidation because of my experience with SPQR. I really did not like jumping around. I just don't think that was conducive to a great reading experience, and I don't think it aided the book at all. So I was a little bit worried about Emperor of Rome, I'll be honest. And I'll tell you what, I really didn't need to be. Yes, the same jumping around is done, but it makes sense based on what kind of the conceit of this book is. This book is a look at the role of the Roman emperor from around the time of its conception, Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, up to sometime in the 200s when she cuts off. The book is structured in an interesting way. Each chapter has a theme. And so under that broader theme, she discusses multiple different Roman emperors and what they did. And she also is talking about, kind of as a larger, broader theme throughout this book, who is the Roman emperor? What does he do? And I learned so much from this. I got a lot of really great, interesting tidbits and fun facts to kind of write down because that to me was interesting. I don't really care that much about the domestic side of history at all. I also don't really care that much about what large groups are doing, if that makes sense. There's a lot of push in history nowadays, and from certain historians where this is really their interest. They're looking at kind of the common populace. That is hard for me to conceptualize because that's a large group. And I'm into history for an individual. That's how I get in, and that's how I enjoy history, is through the lens of a certain person. I have to have somebody to look through, and so I thought I was going to struggle with this, but she really balanced this out. She allowed you to look through the eyes of the emperors, but she also wanted to talk about enslaved people who worked at the palaces. She wanted to talk about the gladiators. She wanted to talk about people in the Senate. And so she talked about those broader groups in an interesting way that made it appealing to me, and that's just not normally my interest. And so, since that's not normally my interest, there was a lot here that I knew nothing about. And so I was really thrilled to read this. So, as I said, this was broken up into different themes for each chapter. And so that meant that we did cover a broad span of time in each chapter. And so we jumped around quite a bit. And we did stick with, this is really my main complaint, we stuck with the same few emperors nearly all the time. She had her favorites. There was a group of maybe 5 to 10 emperors that she came back to time and time again. I think it makes sense. I mean, Hadrian, we could talk about Hadrian for years and years and we wouldn't get bored. So I understand why Hadrian was there. Nero and Caligula are endlessly fascinating. And there's also been a lot written about Hadrian, Nero, Caligula. There's been a lot written about them. There was a lot documented. And so I think it makes sense that she focused in on some of the big names. And also, since this is kind of purported to be just a little bit of a beginner's history, I think she stuck with the big names that you would know. But I got to the point that I really was just waiting for somebody else to be introduced that we hadn't talked about. She did talk about Elagabalus a lot, which I thought was exciting. He was really her rogue emperor to me because most people don't talk about Elagabalus. So I was really excited to see his name pop up quite a bit. So it was interesting who she chose to focus on, but I think we did kind of reach a point of tedium with talking about the same few guys over and over and over again. But the chapters being split up into easy segments like eating. We had an entire chapter on what they ate, which was really interesting to me. And it talked about kind of the structure of the villa, which was interesting because I thought we knew in great detail the outline of the Palatine Hill and the palace on the Palatine Hill. And she actually explained that there are a lot of things on the Palatine Hill that we aren't exactly sure about, and we aren't even sure of the location of things like the kitchens, for example. There's also the most interesting chapter in the book, which is on entertainment. And so they talk a lot about the gladiators going to the chariot races, the building of new structures like the Colosseum. It was incredible to me. That was easily the best chapter in the book. But there are also chapters on things that you expect and things that you associate with the Roman Empire more generally, but with the Roman emperor specifically. So we had things like conquest, which I think we all think of when we think of the Roman emperors. So this was really the opportunity to talk about the so-called great emperors of conquest, like Claudius. Is Claudius a great emperor of conquest? You know, I really don't know, but he does need to be talked about here. Trajan, who I love Trajan, I'm sorry. But what was interesting in these chapters, this is the most interesting fun fact that I learned. It was about how most emperors didn't travel and didn't see the entire empire, especially at its height, let's say in the early 100s, when we're at the height of expansion, we're at the biggest the empire ever was. So people like Trajan went out on campaign and they saw things that way. People like Hadrian, who inherited from Trajan, Hadrian is so fascinating. Hadrian loved to travel, and he went and saw essentially every province that was in the empire. And he's one of the rare few that did this. And I've always thought, oh gee, Hadrian is just so cool. I mean, really, he had a lot of flaws. There were a lot of things wrong with him. He was kind of unhinged in some ways, but I think from that perspective, it's interesting that he wanted to see the empire, and he's one of the few emperors that had hands-on experience in most of the provinces. But the question is how he kept in contact with people who were helping him do the day-to-day running of the empire. I didn't realize this. So much of the Roman Empire was done based on mail and writing letters, but that's done based on the assumption that we know where you are. And there was a period of 2 or 3 years where Hadrian was not in Rome, period. And so they didn't actually know where to address his letters. And so now I'm thinking back, I've always thought of Hadrian as kind of one of the good emperors and one of the best. But when you think about it, a lot of the decisions made can't even have been decisions that he vetoed or that he okayed. He wasn't there, and who knows how much of this he even learned about, because did he get these letters? This book was interesting because it really did contextualize day-to-day life and the day-to-day dealings of ruling an empire of this size. Some of this was really fantastic to me, but I will say, I don't know that this is something that works for me, but I am seeing a trend in a lot of historical nonfiction nowadays that is just like Emperor of Rome, where we are doing themed chapters. And I think that can be great. But I also think it signals the fact that maybe people aren't reading a lot of these books straight through. They are looking to jump around in these chapters based on what they are interested in at the time. And so I think that makes these modern nonfictions a little bit more valuable to, let's say, the student, the university student who needs something specific. But it also leads to more repetition occurring in these nonfiction books where it wouldn't occur normally. And so that's a frustration to me, because we kind of went back and we retreaded old ground when we went into a new chapter and we had to mention, let's say, Titus again. And so we had to go back over the things we knew about Titus. Well, if you're reading the book straight through, which is what I did, you don't need to be reintroduced to Titus. You remember when he was mentioned earlier. And so that makes me wonder about the idea behind books like this and just how they are intended to be read. I think the idea might be that a lot of these more popular histories and modern historical nonfictions, I think they're trying to get in on the university side, and they're trying to be assigned in classes, because I think a lot of popular history is now getting assigned at the university level, which was not the case when I was there. We read a lot of dense stuff. But I think it's great, and I think this book would probably really aid you if you were a student. But I will say, is this a better beginner's book than SPQR? That is for sure to me. The thing about SPQR, and the reason people recommend it, is that it's about broader topics and the broader history of the Roman Empire. And that is why people want to recommend it as a place to start. And I understand why, because a lot of people are getting into this wanting to know the political background, the turnover from republic to empire, which is really interesting. And so maybe when you're coming into this for the first time, you're not necessarily that interested in learning what the emperor did on the day-to-day. But I think if you were at least marginally interested in the Roman Empire, this is a book to start with, and I think it's a great read, really, I do. It was a page turner, quite frankly, to be nonfiction. I do wish that she had gone further a little bit. She cuts off sometime in the 200s, which of course makes sense, because once we reach the 300s, things change very rapidly in the Roman Empire, and even the definition of what the emperor was and what he did, that kind of changes as we reach Constantine's reign in particular. And once there are two emperors, once we split and there's an emperor in Constantinople and an emperor in Rome, I think the definition of what the emperor is, that changes. And so that would have required her to have a broader definition for what she wanted to define. So I see why she zoomed in, but this is clearly her time period. This is her period of interest in terms of the Roman Empire. And I think it's probably the period most people are interested in. So that was disappointing to me, but I see why she did it. I really recommend this. If you have been on the fence about it, it's a great read, and I think it's really fun. I think you learn a lot in it, a lot that you don't expect to learn, which is really fun and makes this kind of engaging in a way that a lot of nonfiction isn't. So I really recommend this, and if you were somebody who was turned off by SPQR like I was, definitely read this, because I think it will change your opinion. Now let's talk about Ravenna by Judith Herrin, which is also Italian history and kind of is a great segue, a great way to move on from Emperor of Rome, because we're just kind of moving up in time period here. So this is a history of the city of Ravenna in Italy from, let's say, the 400s to around the 800s, I think is when this cuts off, which is Ravenna's golden age. Now, if you don't know where Ravenna is about an hour outside of Venice, and it is a gorgeous, gorgeous city that is filled with Byzantine mosaics. And so that's why most people go. That's why I went. I'm not going to lie. But I also went because Dante is buried there. When Dante was exiled from Florence, he went to Ravenna. And so that's really why I went. And the mosaics were a great bonus. But I love Byzantine mosaics. It's one of my favorite things to see. So all of the churches there basically are mosaiced, and they were decorated in the late 5th, early 6th centuries. It is some of the most stunning artwork you will ever have the privilege of seeing. I mean, literally look up some of these churches. Just look up Ravenna, and you'll be stunned. You will literally be stunned. So I have been meaning to read this book for a couple of years since it came out, because I love Ravenna. Ravenna is actually the first city that I visited in Italy, and it has always remained really special to me. So this book really is an interesting look at a time period that most people forget about and that most people label the Dark Ages. And so one of the arguments behind this book is that the Middle Ages aren't that dark at all. She calls it kind of like a lightning period, which was interesting. She really did not want to refer to it as the Middle Ages, but she also didn't want to refer to it as late antiquity, which is what a lot of historians will call this time period. Ravenna was at one time the seat of the Roman Empire in the West. It was the capital of the Roman Empire. At certain points in Rome's history, it was just hard to be down that far in the boot of Italy when there were so many barbarians threatening kind of the borders towards the top. And so the emperor moved at times to Milan, which was closer to the borders, and also to Ravenna. The reason that the move was made to Ravenna is that Ravenna is on the sea, or it was at the time, and so it could be fortified with walls and a port and the Roman navy. I have some interesting questions about this book, and more so, it's about the publication and the quality of the published book, frankly, because there were so many errors in this text. And I got this on ebook. So I didn't get this physically, which I think I would put down to a printing issue before I would anything else. But the fact that I came across so many spelling errors, I mean, so many grammatical errors, quite frankly. Just in general, there were a lot of weird printing things. I don't know if you can call it printing on an e-reader, but there were so many odd things about the text that I frankly wondered how many times it had been gone over in edits, and that scares me, especially with nonfiction. But Judith Herrin is a really respected historian of Byzantine history, so I was shocked by this, quite frankly, and I wonder if the ebook was messed up when it downloaded and I got some kind of weird ebook, but that really did call into question some of the book to me, and I wondered how many times this had been looked over, how many times it had been edited, and basically how many times her peers had reviewed this. I feel like I'm in a good place to know quite a bit about Ravenna, and so I knew a lot of what she was going to talk about, but there were things that were completely new to me, and she was using sources that I had never heard of. But I have never read another book on this topic that so clearly focused in on this city. And so I didn't really have anything to compare this to, which I do think would clarify some of my feelings about this and whether I feel I can recommend it. I feel like I can recommend it because it's just really, really good. If you're curious at all about this stuff, I really think this is a great book. But to me, this was dense. In a way, Emperor of Rome felt like a great gateway into Roman history. This to me feels like step 2 or 3 in your journey to understanding early medieval Christianity, let's say, because Ravenna was a very important Christian center as well, because it was not only a seat of Catholic Christianity, but it was a major seat of Arian Christianity. And Arianism is a heresy, technically, and it was not a heresy at the time. Arianism is a very different form of Christianity that views the Trinity, God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit as 3 separate entities. And thus they view Jesus as truly just a human being who is second to God. Whereas Catholics believe the Trinity is all one, and technically no one is above the other. To Arians, God is the Father, and your Father is above you, the Son. And so this was a really interesting debate in late antiquity, is just kind of how we can interpret the Trinity. There was a lot going on in terms of church history at this time where they were settling which books of the Bible were going to be included, and Arianism really took off with the barbarians. So the Goths in particular were Arians, and they came to power and they eventually ruled in Ravenna. One of my favorite historical figures is Theodoric, who was king of the Goths, and he ruled in Ravenna, and I love him so much. He was an Arian Christian, and if you go to Ravenna, you can see his tomb, which is insane. It's like one of the most beautiful tombs you can ever see. Man thought a lot of himself, but he had taste. I mean, he really was into art. This means that in Ravenna, there is an interesting difference in certain art pieces and in certain mosaics between Catholic Christianity and Arian Christianity. And so there are baptistries where the mosaics show Jesus getting baptized by John the Baptist, which is a very famous story in the Bible, but they will show Jesus nude, which would be anathema to Catholics. But to the Arians, Jesus is a man, so we could show him as a human being. And so this is an interesting art discussion, not just a religious discussion. It's also interesting in how the city is laid out and how it taught religion. So if you know nothing about this kind of religious debate, and if you also don't care anything about kind of late antiquity, early medieval Christianity, this book will be hard to get into, I think, because Sometimes she explains this, sometimes she gives you enough background to understand what's going on. Other times, she kind of assumes you know something. And you could tell from the introduction alone when she is talking about her history with the city. You could tell that she was assuming that most people who picked up this book would understand medieval Christianity. And again, I think that stuff's fascinating. And I also love the city of Ravenna, and I've been. So I kind of got the context for that while there. If you know nothing about this, I really kind of think this book is dense, and at certain times her writing was dense. She also tried to parse things out into separate chapters, but the subjects of those chapters wound up bleeding over into the next chapter more often than not. This was not a book to me that you could jump around in. For example, the very first couple of chapters are about Galla Placidia, who we could sit here and talk about for 25 years. I love this woman so much, but she also has supposedly a tomb. It's not really a tomb, but that's what they call it, there in Ravenna, that is beautifully mosaicked with a starry sky. But Galla Placidia was a woman who was the wife of a Roman emperor, the mother of a Roman emperor, and the daughter of a Roman emperor. And she lived, I mean, an incredibly fascinating life. Genuinely, she did. You would think the chapter that is entitled Galla Placidia is all we're going to get about her. She's going to tell us this woman's life story, and we move on from her. 2 or 3 chapters down the line that are ostensibly about other people, Galla Placidia is still showing up, and she's not dead yet. So her life story continues past those chapters. So this is not a book I would suggest you jump around in. There's also, unfortunately, but I think we assume this all the time when we think about the so-called Dark Ages or early medieval period, there's a lot of guesswork done on her part as a historian here. Basically from around 476, let's say, to around 700, the history of Ravenna is incredibly murky. We know some things happened, we know where they happened, and we kind of know who was in charge, but there is a lot of guesswork that has to be done to fill in the blanks for this time period. And she does that quite brilliantly, in my opinion, and this didn't frustrate me in the way that it normally does, because this wasn't a biography. In some ways, it's a biography of this place, of this city, but it is not a biography of a single person, and that's where that frustrates me, that's where that bothers me. But again, she had to make a lot of guesswork, and if that's something that bothers you, I think you're going to struggle in parts with this book. I just love the early medieval period. I love late antiquity. And so this was kind of just working for me on a subject level. I do think she got lost in the weeds a bit with some details. There was a lot about money in this book. And I'll be honest with you, that is one thing that I'm not interested in. When we start talking about coinage, when we start talking about the depreciation of coinage across the Roman Empire, my brain starts to melt just a little bit. And there was a lot about coinage in this book and how important it was that certain people were on coins, because there was a mint at Ravenna that carried on past the fall of the West. So it's important to know, I guess, that that's kind of what they were known for in some circles. But at the same time, did we need to know about them printing money every few chapters? I mean, long paragraphs about silver coinage, gold coinage. At what point do we start adding stuff to the silver to kind of devalue it? It's interesting if you really like to get into the nitty-gritty, but that to me is tedious stuff. But she does offer a lot of detail that I don't think I have read anywhere else. So I personally really enjoyed this. I just love Ravenna. It made me wish I was there the whole time. The unfortunate thing is, or maybe the fortunate thing, she does really focus in on a particular time period. And Ravenna is really interesting as we get into the later medieval period, and it's under the control of Venice. And I thought it was unfortunate that we didn't make it that far. And I guess to me, the issue is that the book was called Ravenna, which I think made me think it was just going to be a broader history of the city, and it was going to carry on up to the time that Byron lived there. But that is not what this book is. It is really interested in what we call Ravenna's height, basically during the time of the Mosaicists, and also when the kings of Italy settled there. So that's what's really interesting, and I think it's a time period that most people don't know anything about. So the book had a lot to offer that was really new, and I thought was quite fascinating. So I really enjoyed this. I did have some issues with it, but a lot of that I think was due genuinely to the ebook. So I just kind of wonder, did I wind up with a weird ebook? Did it download properly? Otherwise, I really recommend this. Last but not least, I feel like I'm kind of cheating a little with this one. We have to talk about The Princess and the Tower by Philippa Langley. So this is the most recent release. It also came out in November. Ravenna is a book that's a couple of years old, but this book is Philippa Langley's take on The Princess and the Tower, and she is essentially trying to solve the mystery of what happened to them. The reason I say this is cheating is that this book is structured in an interesting way. I feel like all three of these books that I'm talking about today had very interesting structures for nonfiction, but Philippa Langley lays this book out as if we are solving a missing persons case. And so there's a lot about this that reads a little bit like you're reading a police procedural, or you're going through documentation and you're being asked to solve the mystery with the information that you have at hand. And so I think that was fun. I think that made this very interactive, but I also wonder if it means that this is really historical nonfiction. She is mostly talking about new evidence that she has found that supports her theory that the princess survived. And if you know nothing about Philippa Langley, she is the woman who was responsible for discovering Richard III's body back in 2012 when he was buried beneath a car park. So she is someone who is very high in the Richard III Society, and she is also someone who has made some significant historical discoveries in the past. So I think a lot of people were really excited about this release and were really curious to see what she would come out with. Essentially, she has found a few documents in the Low Countries that suggest that Perkin Warbeck was actually Richard, Duke of York. And Perkin Warbeck is someone who was a pretender to the English throne in the 1490s, so during the reign of Henry VII. And he claimed that he was the younger of the princes in the Tower and that he had somehow gotten away from captivity in the Tower of London. He had a lot of incredibly powerful backers. He had a lot of people who really believed him, including family members. And so this has always been an interesting story. He is eventually executed for this. And I think for a very long time, most people would say they don't believe he actually is one of the princes in the Tower. Now, according to this new information, I think this suggests that there were a lot of people at the time who believed he was legitimately a good claimant to the English throne, that he legitimately was one of the princes in the Tower. But it doesn't confirm at all that the princes in the Tower escaped, if that makes sense. This just confirms that people believe a pretender to the throne actually is who he says he is. But the conceit of this book is that she believes they lived and that they certainly outlived the reign of Richard. And you might can assume, knowing that Philippa Langley is in the Richard III Society and that she's a big fan of Richard, she doesn't believe he had them killed. And so a lot of this book is spent kind of scrubbing Richard's name clean, but it's also spent really looking at other conspirators and other people who possibly could have had a motive to kill them. But in her personal opinion, and she'll tell you this in the book, she believes they didn't die. And this is a really popular theory. A lot of people think they got away or that they were swapped out with other children. Now, if they were swapped out with other children, this still means somebody was out there who wanted to have them dead or who wanted to kill them. So that doesn't actually solve the mystery of who killed the princes in the Tower, because somebody still did think they were killing them. But it's always been a theory that's been a little bit saccharine, a little bit sweet, and a little bit unbelievable to most people in the history community. And so I think a lot of people are skeptical about this book, and they're skeptical about what Philippa Langley has found, with good reason. But other people are taking this as a really good sign, and a lot of people are saying we can now consider Richard to be innocent. I don't know that I'm at that point. I am a massive fan of Richard III. I think y'all know this, and I also don't believe he did it. But I don't necessarily think this book proved his innocence to any degree, and that right there tells you something. That she talks in this book about clearing Richard's name. And that's kind of what she's interested in. She says this in the introduction. So she doesn't even necessarily say, what happened to the princes in the Tower? That's my goal, is to find out what happened to them. She is interested in it from Richard's perspective and from trying to clear Richard's name, which I think means you have to go into this book understanding she wanted there to be a particular outcome. And so I think you know what this book is if you know anything about her. And you also know that it's going to be a positive outcome for Richard, because I just don't personally believe that anyone in the Richard III Society would have published a book that condemned him at all, or that really published new information that made him look bad. She has something to say for everything that has ever made Richard look bad. She has a defense for him. She has a way to say, well, actually, he was right. Those things to me are a little bit frustrating to read, because I think we can all agree that Richard III was a man of his time. Wasn't a great time to be alive. It also wasn't a great time to be a member of any royal family. And so there are definitely things he did that are shady and that can't be defended. But I am telling you, this woman will offer up a defense for him on any subject. Henry VII comes off so bad in this book, it's unbelievable. She constantly calls him a usurper. At one point she says, because he actually is one of the favored suspects for who killed the princes, this is not just from her perspective, a lot of people think Henry VII could have had something to do with it, but at one point she says, when she is discussing him as a suspect for this, she says he was known to be extremely cruel, and he was just so mean to people. And I'm thinking, when? You know, when were these instances of cruelty when it wasn't for a political reason? Yes, Henry VII was petty. I think we can all agree on that. He dated his reign to the day before the battle that he won that made him the King of England. And so if you fought against him at that battle, you're a traitor. So, I mean, that's petty, but that's also political. I don't necessarily think we can call that cruel. And I say all of this as someone who loves Richard. I am on Richard's side, you know? I would go to bat for Richard, but I don't think I would do it like this, because I kind of think being so positive about Richard, that makes people not take you that seriously, if you know what I'm saying. There are a lot of things that speak to Richard's supposed innocence, but there are a lot of things that also speak to Richard's supposed guilt. And I think if we ignore those, or we don't discuss those as actual possibilities of something that happened, I kind of think that lessens the argument of the book. And that to me is where she fell short, because I know she loves Richard. Girl, so do I. But this really called for some nuance, and it called for you to be unbiased as much as possible. And that's hard to do. If you're into Richard at all, that is so hard to do. But I just think she made her bias so plain. And she made it very clear that she went into this book hoping for a certain outcome. I still really enjoyed it. I agree with some of what she said, and I learned a lot here. But there are some definite issues here, and I can see why this has gotten so many controversial reviews since its publication, because it's really interesting what she found, but I really don't think it proves Richard's innocence at all, and it also doesn't prove the princess survived. Maybe they outlived Richard. Maybe Richard didn't do it. I don't think he did. But I really don't think this proves that Perkin Warbeck actually was who he said he was. This is also not a good beginner's book. If you know nothing about the Wars of the Roses, you know nothing about Richard, if you know nothing about the mystery of the Princess in the Tower, this is not the one to start with. She assumes you know everything that's going on when you walk into this book. In fact, in some ways, this is really dense in terms of how she discusses certain historical documents, and she quotes from these documents heavily, which is really wonderful, but that makes this a really dense read, and I think you kind of have to be obsessed with this time period to really get into it. I feel like I'm very well versed in this time period, and especially in Richard's reign. She still taught me things that I did not know, and so this is definitely not a beginner's book. But I also wonder if it's a book that you can really recommend someone who's into the Wars of the Roses, because it depends on what you're looking to get out of it. I think this book has been so interesting because of the conversations it has started, and I'm really interested to see what else her project does, because this is not the end. She says in this book she is still working to find more information. So I think that's great. It's an enjoyable read, and I think the structure of it makes it kind of fun, because you're figuring things out and you're putting the puzzle together as she describes it to you, which is also really fun and makes this kind of engaging. But it is, like I said, to me, it's kind of a hard book to recommend. I feel like the type of person who's interested in this has already picked it up or is already aware of it. But if you're on the fence, I do say pick this one up because it did offer something new to me, and it really is some groundbreaking historical research. She has found things that have lingered in archives for centuries. So that's exciting to me, and that's always really fun to read. So I still really recommend this. I read 3 great nonfictions this month. I wish that I had finished my 4th to talk about, but I feel like I've been talking here for like 45 minutes. I would love to know if you have read any of these down below, if you have any historical nonfiction recommendations. How did your nonfiction November go? But that's going to be all from me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.